A covalent bond is defined as a pair of electrons that is being shared between two atoms. The electrons in a covalent bond are not always shared equally, however, and that's because of a property called electronegativity. All of the elements have electronegativity associated with them, and this allows them to hold on to electrons more tightly or less tightly. In other words, elements that have high electronegativity draw electrons closer to them. Elements that have lower electronegativity cannot hold on to the electrons as tightly as other elements. If we look at the four elements that we've called critical in biological systems, the scale of electronegativity looks like this. Oxygen has the highest electronegativity in that group, and oxygen is greater than nitrogen, which comes second. Nitrogen is greater than both carbon and hydrogen in electronegativity. Now this is an approximate symbol. It turns out that carbon and hydrogen are slightly different in their electronegativity, but the difference isn't important biologically speaking. So we're going to consider carbon and hydrogen as having the same electronegativity. And it's a low electronegativity, lower than both nitrogen and oxygen. Now, when two atoms come together and form a covalent bond, and those two atoms have differing electronegativity, we're going to see uneven or asymmetrical sharing of electrons in that bond. And this is what we call a polar covalent bond. Sometimes two atoms that have the same electronegativity will come together and form a covalent bond. With the same electronegativity, that means that the electrons will be shared equally between them, or symmetrically. When that happens, it forms a non-polar covalent bond. So, if an oxygen atom were to form a covalent bond with a carbon atom, because oxygen has a higher electronegativity than carbon, the electron pair in the covalent bond would be pulled much more closely to the oxygen than to the carbon. That would be a polar covalent bond. If a carbon atom were to form a covalent bond with a hydrogen atom, however, because they have the same electronegativity, the electrons would be shared equally right in the center of the bond. On this slide, we're looking at two drawings of molecules and the electrons that reside in the covalent bonds. Up at the top of the slide, you can see a depiction of hydrogen gas. Two hydrogen atoms bound together covalently. Remember, when you see this solid line drawn between two atoms, that tells you that it's a covalent bond, a strong, stable bond holding those two atoms together. And remember that all a covalent bond is a pair of shared electrons between those two atoms. So in this diagram, they've drawn in the electron pair. One electron above, one electron below. Now, when you have two of the same atoms coming together with a covalent bond, those same atoms are going to have the same electronegativity, of course. They're going to be pulling on the electron pair equally in both directions. And that's being shown by placing the electron pair right in the center of that bond. Each one of these hydrogen atoms has a relatively low electronegativity. Each atom is pulling slightly on the electron pair, but they're pulling in opposite directions, equal and opposite directions, and the electrons are sitting right in the center of the bond. This is what we would call a non-polar covalent bond. Now, in comparison, at the bottom we're looking at a water molecule. There's one oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms. We've got a covalent bond here and a covalent bond here. Now, when we compare the electronegativity of oxygen and hydrogen, they are quite different. The oxygen atom has a high electronegativity, and the hydrogen atoms have low electronegativity. What that means is that the oxygen atom is going to pull more strongly on each of these electron pairs and draw those electron pairs up close to it. In the drawing, this is depicted by showing the electron pairs right up next to the oxygen atom and far away from each of the hydrogen atoms. These are what we would call polar covalent bonds. Asymmetrical sharing of electrons, uneven sharing of electrons. Now there's something else to notice in this drawing, and that's these little symbols right here. If you don't recognize this symbol, this is a lowercase d, which stands for delta, and you'll notice that the d has a charge associated with it, either a minus or a plus. This is a designation for partial charges. You can see that both of the hydrogen atoms are partially positive, and the oxygen atom is partially negative. Now, it's important to know that partial charge is very different from a true charge that you might see on an atom. Water is not charged. Water is a neutral molecule. But within the molecule, there are partial charges. Let's look at where they come from. Remember that within an atom, electrons are negative. They are negatively charged particles. So when an atom like oxygen pulls electrons up close to it, it's becoming slightly more negative because of its association with these negatively charged particles. It's not that the oxygen itself has a negative charge. It doesn't. But it's becoming partially negative because it's sitting so close to these negatively charged electrons. Now compare that to the hydrogen atoms. These atoms are also uncharged, but in this particular bond, they are quite far away, relatively speaking, from the negatively charged electrons. So they have become a little bit less negative or partially positive. The hydrogen atoms in a water molecule are partially positive because they sit far away from the electron pairs. The oxygen atom is partially negative because it sits very close to the electron pairs. Any molecule that contains polar covalent bonds has these partial charges within it. Polar covalent bonds produce partial charges in molecules. Water is a great example of this. It's the oxygen atom in a water molecule that pulls the electrons close to it and becomes partially negative. Non-polar covalent bonds share electron pairs equally and so produce no partial charges. Methane is a great example of this. Methane is composed of one carbon atom and 4 hydrogen atoms. And because carbon and hydrogen have the same electronegativity, they're going to share the pairs of electrons equally in the covalent bonds. That means there will be no partial charges created. Non-polar covalent bonds are formed. Now, there is a property in some molecules where we see both polar covalent bonds and nonpolar covalent bonds in the same molecule. Now, the reason this happens is because many biological molecules are quite large and contain a lot of covalent bonds. Some of them will be polar and some of them will be nonpolar. When a molecule has both polar and nonpolar characteristics within it, we give that a name. We call that molecule amphipathic. Amphipathic translates as dual symphony. And what it means is that some molecules are like two symphonies going on at the same time, a polar and a nonpolar. Proteins are amphipathic. So are lipids, particularly the phospholipids that make up cell membranes. So the difference between polar and nonpolar covalent bonds is all about these partial charges. And the partial charges occur when there's a difference in electronegativity between the two atoms that make up the bond. If one atom has a higher electronegativity than the other atom in the bond, the electrons are going to be shared unequally. They will be drawn closer to the atom that has the higher electronegativity. That atom will become partially negative, the other atom will become partially positive, and this will be called a polar covalent bond. Now, sometimes when two atoms come together and they have unpaired electrons in their valence shells, something very different happens other than the sharing of that pair of electrons. Sometimes one of the atoms will donate its electron to the other atom. This creates what we call ions. So ions are simply atoms that have lost or gained an electron in order to make them more stable, particularly in a watery environment like a cell. Ions carry charges, actual true charges. For example, sodium, when it's placed into water, ionizes. It becomes Na+. Chloride becomes Cl-. When you see that plus, what that's telling you is that this atom of sodium has lost an electron. It has become less negative and therefore more positive. Chloride, in comparison, has gained an electron and become more negative, hence the negative charge. When an ion, like that sodium, forms from the loss of an electron, we call that a cation. When an ion forms by gaining an electron, we call that an anion. So cations and anions are just the two different types of ion, depending on their charge. And when two ions come together like this and transfer electrons, they are forming what we call an ionic bond. Ionic bonds are slightly less strong than covalent bonds are. On this slide, we're looking at a drawing of what happens when sodium and chloride come together and form an ionic bond. If you start at the top left-hand side of the slide, you're looking at a sodium atom. You can see in the center a depiction of its atomic nucleus. Remember, that's where the protons and neutrons are. And then we can see a depiction of the electron shells. You'll notice that in all of the shells, we have paired electrons, except for this valence shell. There's a single unpaired electron in the valence shell. And we now know that that makes this sodium atom unstable. Down at the bottom on the left-hand side, we can see a chloride atom. And we can see the same problem in this atom. While there are pairs of electrons in the valence shell, there is one unpaired electron here. And again, that makes this atom unstable. These two unstable atoms are going to come together, not to share their unpaired electrons, but to transfer them in order to become more stable through the formation of an ionic bond. The sodium atom is going to actually transfer or donate its unpaired electron. It's going to let it go. The chloride atom is going to receive or accept that donated electron, and now it has a pair. The chloride ion has gained an electron to create a pair. The sodium atom has lost an electron, so now it no longer has any unpaired electrons. This again removes the problem of those unpaired electrons. It just does it in a different way. Instead of sharing the unpaired electrons, these two atoms are transferring them and creating an ionic bond in the process. Now, ionic bonds are non-covalent. They are not covalent type. There are a couple of other non-covalent bonds that we need to know about as we learn about anatomy and physiology. The first type is known as a hydrogen bond, and the second type is known as van der Waals interactions. Both of these are weak interactions between atoms. They can be between two atoms, they can be between two molecules, they can be between different parts of the same molecule. The idea is the same. There's going to be attraction here. Two things are going to be drawn together and held together, but not nearly as strongly as they would in a covalent bond. Hydrogen bonds will form between partially positive parts of a molecule and partially negative parts of a molecule. In other words, hydrogen bonds form between polar things. Another term we can use when we talk about hydrogen bonding is this term, hydrophilic. If you translate this word, hydrophilic means water-loving. It turns out that polar things, things that have partial charges, are hydrophilic. They like to be in and around water molecules. A good example of where we find hydrogen bonding is between the two strands of DNA in the double helix. Each strand of DNA is formed through covalent bonding, but when the two strands come together, the bases on each strand will be attracted to each other and will combine with hydrogen bonding. Compare that now to van der Waals interactions. Like hydrogen bonding, van der Waals interactions are weak attractions between two molecules or, again, two parts of the same molecule. Van der Waals interactions form where we see non-polar things. These will form among hydrophobic regions of a molecule, or water-fearing regions, the types of molecules that don't like being around water and will in fact be repelled by water. A good example of this is the lipid, again, that we find in cell membranes. Let's go back to water for a minute, because water is a great example of hydrogen bonding in action. Remember, water is polar. It contains partial charges, and so it's made up of polar covalent bonds. The oxygen atom is partially negative because it's drawing the electron pairs up close to it. The hydrogen atoms are partially positive because they are relatively farther away from those negatively charged electrons. When multiple water molecules come together, something very interesting happens. They start to hydrogen bond with each other. Remember, hydrogen bonds are weak attractions. They are not strong covalent bonds. When we draw them, instead of drawing a solid black line, we typically draw a dotted line to indicate that they are weak attractions holding things together. Hydrogen bonds form only between polar things, only between molecules that have partial charges in them. The partially negative oxygen atom will hydrogen bond with partially positive hydrogen atoms. Now, the hydrogen bonding that occurs between water molecules is what gives water some of its most interesting chemical characteristics. It's hydrogen bonding, in other words, that creates the surface tension in water. And you've all seen surface tension in action. I'm sure you've seen at some point the types of insects that can essentially walk on water. They are so light and so delicate that when they balance on the surface of water, they don't sink. That's because of the surface tension on the water created by hydrogen bonding. You may have floated something like a paperclip on the surface of water. If you're very careful and very gentle placing the paperclip onto the water, it will stay on the surface of the water, again because of surface tension. The other chemical characteristic that water has, due to hydrogen bonding, is a high heat storage capacity. This is important because high heat storage allows organisms to store enough heat to keep their body systems working correctly, even in the coldest of environmental temperatures. Remember, living things on our planet are based on water. We are primarily made out of water, and so it's critical that water has this high heat storage capacity. That's all due to hydrogen bonding between water molecules. Now, why do we care about all of this chemistry? After all, this is an anatomy and physiology class, isn't it? Why do we need to know all this biochemistry? Well, it's important for us to understand that living things like human beings actually contain relatively few chemical elements. And that means that there are relatively few types of atoms in living cells. Those few atoms combine into a relatively small number of molecules that create all of the complex, complicated structural components that make up the human body. And the reason that this is possible is because of the chemistry of that small number of atoms and molecules. The chemistry is what determines how carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen are going to interact with each other. The chemistry is what's going to determine which things are polar and which are nonpolar. The chemistry is going to determine whether things can bond covalently or whether we're dealing with non-covalent things like ionic bonding, hydrogen bonding, and van der Waals interactions. a relatively small number of elements, atoms and molecules, leading to a very complicated array of structures, which allow for complicated functions to occur. Remember, it's the structure inside of cells that allows them to function the way they do. Everything from metabolic reactions, things like cellular respiration, photosynthesis, movement, sensation, nerve transmission, muscle contraction, all of it is ultimately the result of the chemistry of those small number of elements.